Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Children and Young People Scrutiny Review Board. I'll be chairing the meeting tonight. If we can start with a brief introduction of yourself and your title. So, my name's Kurt Cuss. I'm a councillor for Alveston Ward and the Vice Chair of this board. Oops, sorry.
I'm Dominic Monaghan, Democratic Services Officer. Thank you.
Steve Grundy. I'm from Firs School. I'm a governor there.
Councillor Paul Hazagrave from Abbey Wood.
Councillor Sue Bonser from Abbey Ward.
Hi there, Gamal is the Director for Commissioning, Derby City Council.
Hi there, it's Pauline Anderson, Director of Learning, Inclusion and Skills, Derby City Council.
Thank you for that. Just going on to the agenda now. Have we got any apologies?
We have apologies for Councillor Lind and Nikki Fenton. Thank you.
Okay, any late items to be introduced by the Chair? There's none. Declarations of interest. Has anyone got any declarations of interest to note? Okay, item 4, minutes of a meeting held on the 18th of October 2021. Can we all agree that it's a true record? Yes? You was. Okay, moving on to item 5, community short break for disabled children and young people service update.
Thank you, Chair. I'm happy to pick that up. I think Dom was going to put up a presentation. Thank you, Chair. This is a short report outlining a tendering process that's about to start shortly to re-procure a short breaks contract for respite for children and young people with learning disabilities and special needs. If I, Chair, just draw out, there's a main report that's within the agenda. This presentation was just for headlines from that report. So in terms of the service itself, around 190 children and young people receive this short break service. Almost 14,000 hours of support being delivered, and it's currently delivered by 2 providers. The specification for this contract has been co-produced with parent carers together, other special needs service providers, and that procurement is underway now from December 2021. Demands on the service are increasing. There's excellent feedback on the service outcomes that have been delivered, and of course supporting our children and young people with special needs is a priority. Thanks, you, Dom. And in terms of the aim of the service is to provide support at home or out in the community for disabled children, and to enjoy daytime activities and spend time away from their parents, carers, and providing respite for the family. As I mentioned earlier, Chair, this is a co-produced revised specification, which is really, really good news. That tender is out at the moment. The current provision ends in March, so we're looking at that re-tendering process underway to get a new service up and running, a re-procure service by April. The bottom half of that bullet slide outlines that the community short breaks team is based within the social care team at the Lighthouse, manage all the referrals from parents, and it's also a service that's available for those families who are not in receipt of any of the short break support service. So, Chair, in summary, it's a very valued service, a real good example of co-production, and look forward to that re-tendered process and have more providers on the framework. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you for bringing this report to the board tonight. I think it would have been quite difficult in the last 2 years providing the service with restrictions in place. Has any councillors got any questions?
Just to make the kind of an observation that we shouldn't underestimate the commitment and devotion of these parents to their children and how taxing that is. It's a 24-hour job being a parent, but those 24 hours are probably longer when they have children who need a lot of care. And, they need a break like anyone else. So I'm really pleased that this is being provided and offered to parents because I think they do need that respite. It benefits the whole family, the parents, the individuals and the children.
Evening, Chair. Apologies. I was a couple of minutes late just to give a notice, if you like, of my business. I've actually got children with ASD and who also access this particular care. So I just wanted to make that clear as in the minutes that I have an interest in that. But just to say that I have been benefited massively from this, as you've pointed out there, having children with special educational needs, and a lot of over the last 2 years, particularly with children who have had to homeschool. It's extremely difficult for them to do homeschooling as it is. My children have never done homework, for example, because they can't distinguish between school and home as being a learning environment and a safe environment. So there was a lot of challenges there, and I think there's many families that have experienced that. And I think that we have to admit that it hasn't always been smooth sailing with the support that that has been able to be offered during COVID, and that has put on more pressure to families that are already extremely pressured. But the systems are there and are benefiting many. And I just think if there's any more that we can do to support those, if in terms of making sure that that's available for those that are in need and accessing that, then that's great.
Has anyone got any more questions?
Chair, I have a further recommendation to the one provided. I don't know how to word this exactly, but to thank all partners in this work, this important work to support families.
Yeah, I agree. I've got a couple of questions on the matter, please. I see in the papers it says you're looking for a third provider, which will give you more flexibility. Do you think 3 is enough, or do you think in the future we might need to look for a fourth provider?
Thank you, Chair. Just to answer that, what we're hoping for is a couple of things in terms of that there are more providers than the current 3, but also as the report outlines, we will also be joining the Derbyshire County Council short breaks framework, which they're tendering in March as well to re-procure. So that those two mechanisms in terms of our short breaks procurement together with the Derbyshire framework and joining that framework for Derby City providers and Derby City Council to use it, I think will give us and families more access to a wider choice of providers in that space, Chair.
Thank you. Just another question, please. Let me just make sure I'm on the right page. It says on the presentation there's 190 children and young people that are receiving service of almost 14,000 hours of support being delivered, which is fantastic. However, the report lacks historical information. So is there any historical data? The reason why I ask this is because if there's next year 300 children, but it's still at 14,000 hours, then we could have a look and question whether that service needs more support.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I mean, it's been a bit more difficult to benchmark because of COVID over the last few years, but certainly we have that data. This short breaks contract has been operating for a number of years, so we will be baselining around the number of hours, how families have been able to access, and sufficient providers to deliver that. So that baseline of information will be available. It's a little bit more difficult because of COVID over the last couple of years around sort of genuinely benchmarking that, but we have information that goes back, as well as we will continue to closely monitor that there are enough providers to deliver the provision, because it's an annual provision with a value of about 250,000, and it's normally a 4-year contract, so it's close to £1 million over those 4 years. So, Chair, in summary, yes, data would be available.
Is it worth... sorry.
Yeah, just to echo your thoughts on that, really. From my perspective, I think it's going to be a real challenge to compare over the last couple of years. We know that it's not only the support that's offered, but the people that are taking it up, because of those that have their families with other complications and risk of severe complications with COVID. So it may be that the hours were offered but not taken, and then you've got the factors in around staffing levels and COVID implications on themselves. And I think it's going to be a real struggle to you're sort of comparing apples with pears on this front. I think what would be interesting is to see for the sake of comparison, to seeing where it was and the assumptions, but probably a bit more detail around that, and in terms of hours offered, and the implications of what that is, rather than just comparing apples and pears, if you like. I think we need to get a bit more in depth in there, and to see if there's anything that we can do to support the families in mitigating their concerns, or looking at alternative provisions and things like that. So probably a little bit more complex than just looking at a comparison with prior year.
Yeah, I totally agree. You cannot really compare historical data with the last 2 years. But moving forward, if we have that data, and we can make sure we're on the right track to get back to some kind of normality. And again, if we can have a look at what hours were provided, even if they weren't taken up.
Thank you, Chair. That's absolutely fine. And, Chair, just to also clarify that as a council, of course, we were concerned about during the COVID period. So just for reassurance here, what we did do was continued with payments to the short breaks providers during that COVID period to ensure that they remained viable and in business, and therefore worked very closely with both providers and other contracts as well, Chair. So absolutely agree, offered as much flexibility as possible for continuity, but that your suggestion in terms of baselining is very welcome, because we want to try and make sure families are able to access the service and providers are able to provide it flexibly and in a safe environment where families are comfortable using that service. Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions? Okay, just moving on to the recommendations. So recommendation 2.1, to note the service provision details within this report, and Councillor Hazelgrave added a recommendation. Have you got that one, Dominic?
Yes, Chair, and obviously the recommendation to look into supporting, where possible, mitigating the issues around COVID, and as you said, putting the service back to as prior COVID as we can.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I had my mic on then. Do we agree on these recommendations? Okay, thank you. Okay, moving on to item 6. Feedback on the DFE National Catch-up provision from Derby schools.
Chair, apologies. Just to, again, point out a declaration of interest. I am now working for a school, and I think that should has already been noted by the council, but just to make it clear for this particular meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. So the exam question for me tonight was actually about the DFE catch-up programme and Derby schools, but we have actually very little information about what's happening in Derby schools. So I agreed with Councillor Lind that I would give an overview of the national funding, and that has proved to be really interesting. And the huge caveat is that everything that is in the slides tonight comes from the government website, and it is entirely contradictory. There are lists that are, not being political, but there are, it is obvious that there are headlines and then there are, accountancy questions, and we've got accountants in the room. So these are, everything that I'm saying tonight comes to give you an overview, but to show you also the complexity, and then a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel, and I'll explain to you how we might move forward and get a better picture for Derby. So, moving on, thank you. So in June 2020, the government did announce, and that was fairly clear, and that was the height of the first lockdown, the £1 billion worth of funding to support young children and young people. This is all about those missing out on learning, and this is all about COVID-19, and especially to focus on the most vulnerable pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds, who we know have been the most affected. Next slide, thank you. As we know, Sir Kevin Collins was appointed as the catch-up czar, and then following his recommendations of the requirement for approximately 13.5 billion, he actually put forward plans costing 15 billion, but he calculated it slightly less, and the DFE would not support his recommendation. So Kevin Collins resigned as the catch-up czar. So we don't actually have one of those at the moment, and I think that is a great shame. I know Kevin Collins personally. He's absolutely passionate. Like me, he was a teacher in Bradford many years ago, and really cares deeply about children and families. So there is a bit of a loss there really to the country, but we are where we are, and I'm here to give you the position. So moving on, thank you. So the programme that is, this is now taken directly from the government website, and this universal catch-up premium, as it's called, has been there to ensure schools have the support that's needed. And that is mainly through a national tutoring programme. And that's an interesting one, because when locally we talk to schools about the tutoring programme, the biggest barrier is accessing high quality tutors who are around, in and around Derby. There is a huge pressure on that group of people, and my friend runs one of the Kip McGrath Centres, which is a tutoring agency in Leeds, and he says, the demand is really, really high, and it's really hard to meet that demand. But this is what's been offered, a schools programme for 5 to 16-year-olds, again through national tutoring programmes, and a 16 to 19 tuition fund. And I think that's quite a vulnerable group of older learners. And the oral language intervention programme for reception-age children. So that is the main thrust of the government programme. Thank you. So eligible settings are primary, secondary, all through local authority maintained academies and free schools. So not the independent sector. So it's all state funded schools really, including special schools and academies, and also pupil referral units, alternative provision, etc., and hospital schools and academies. So that really covers the majority of schools. The exception to the independent is the independent special schools, which are mainly commissioned places for local authorities. So, there is a high level of eligibility, and that's good news. Thank you. So school allocations are on a per pupil basis. Mainstream schools getting £80 per pupil from reception to year 11. And then the following settings get £240 for each place during 2020-21, and there is a list there of those specialist alternative providers and hospital schools. And then there is a national weighting to specialist settings, recognising the high costs that they face, which is outlined there. Next slide, thank you. So, how the fundings allocations are calculated. They use the 4 to 15 pupil head count from the October 2020 census. Anybody working in a school, any head teachers or governors would want to know when the funding is calculated. And then so on, taking the academic year place numbers from the published local authority financial year budget returns for local authority maintained schools. And the published high needs place numbers, which are the specialist needs, special education and alternative provision for 2020-21 academic year for academies and special schools not maintained by local authority. And then similar to pupil premium, which is an additional funding element for pupils, schools should use a sum available to them as a single total, even though the funding is calculated on a per pupil basis, so they can use it for grouping together activity and broader activities, so that a parent can't request that that single amount is spent on their individual child. So that funding is only available for the 2021 academic year, which of course it has just ended, but it will not be added to school baselines in future year funding allocations. Next slide, please. So using catch-up funding, there is quite a lot of guidance on how to use the funding for specific activities and in line with curriculum expectations. And schools will have a lot of flexibility and they will know their own cohort, and I think that's where we are in Derby schools, that not every school is using the funding in an identical way. They have different children and different groups of children, and communities have different needs. And there is a focus on disadvantaged and vulnerable groups, as we know they're the most affected, and that will affect some of our schools, of course, more than others. So the Education Endowment Foundation, the EEF, has published a support guide for schools, and there is guidance there about how to spend the funding. And the school planning guide, which came out mid-2020, provided quite a lot of detailed guidance, and I think that's of quite high quality. And they can also use a catch-up premium to support summer catch-up provision that they're offering, because schools can add additional summer catch-up activity to the holiday activity offer. Thank you. So if you're a school leader or a governor or you work in a school, it's important that you are aware that you have to show how the funding is being used to support educational recovery, and looking at the curriculum expectations, and that's all in the Action for Schools During Coronavirus Outbreak guidance. And governors, and I know this is happening, we've had experience of it, governors and trustees are scrutinising school approaches to catch up. It is very, very high priority for Derby schools, and head teachers are clearly sharing their plans with their governors about the use of catch-up funding. And this is also it is also really important that this is transparent for parents, and explains here what academies and schools should publish online about their catch-up premium, usually on their school website. So that's where you should be able to find, if you were looking for individual schools, more information. Next slide. So The DFE has asked schools to complete a return on this in January, and we have agreed with our head teacher colleagues that once that return is completed, we will then look at analysing the total return for the city to see how much of that catch-up has been used, looking at what it's been used for, what resources have been bought, and analysing this issue about tuition and whether tutors are still difficult to access because they're a fundamental part of the programme. And we suggest after that return that we come back to this board and present to you the Derby information. So I conclude there, and any questions, thank you.
Thank you very much for the report, and I totally agree. After January, when we get the submissions back of the returns, we should bring it back to this board, and then we can have a look at the data. I'd also like to thank Councillor Hazelgrave for raising this matter in full council meeting, and to Councillor Lind, who added the amendment which brought it to this board as well. Is there any questions?
Thank you, Chair. I think it's important to note what we're saying here is kind of jump the gun a little bit in terms of assessing what Derby has been able to achieve in terms of scrutiny, because we haven't got that information to date, and it's going to be extremely important to look at that and to challenge those schools effectively. But I think you've pointed out there that it's for the governors to ensure that they are pulling this up, and for parents to have that knowledge and information available to them to challenge as well. So from this perspective, I think it's going to be key to bring this back at the right time with the correct sort of analysis and detail, rather than sort of speculation at this point until we can have that information in front of us.
Yeah, just to respond to that, Chair, absolutely. And in a way, this presentation is a bridge and an opportunity to look at what for some councillors who hadn't perhaps been aware of the national programme. I think one of the things we can do is to scrutinise school websites. It's something that we do for particular reasons, maybe safeguarding policies, etc. If we want to look at a particular policy, then you can learn a lot by looking at a school website, and that might be a good place to start in addition to the January census return. So, yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. If we can add a recommendation into there which says to update the board again after the January returns has been completed. If everyone's in agreement to that. Councillor Hazelgrave.
Thanks, Pauline, for this. I know you've kind of cut and pasted from DFE, and we have to just accept it as it is. I do think it's lamentable that this is just seen as a one-year programme, when clearly there are gaps in kids' education that are going to take a long time to sort out. And to have a view that throwing 650 million in one pot and 350 million in another is going to sort it out in 1 year just doesn't understand what the whole process of education is all about. I mean, there's been the whole thing, is crazy. It's also crazy. Some of these ideas we've had in the past, people float the idea we don't need kids to go to school anymore. They can all learn from home remotely. And that's blown out of the water completely. It was always a crazy idea, but people said, oh, we can then sell off all the school buildings. We only need a small building. We can sell off the playing fields. All this kind of thing. Nonsense. Education needs to take place in the classroom with high quality teaching and support in the classroom, and really good relationships with parents who are supportive. I think this thing of gathering the data in January is good. I think it would also be worthwhile trying to capture what people have found have gone well, and also what has not gone so well, only so that other people don't fall into the trap of picking something that looks on the surface brilliant, but is actually doesn't deliver, and that's a great failure to the kids, and it's a form of trickery that's despicable, in my opinion. But I think the issue there as well is, although we didn't get 15 billion devoted, and we've got a billion in bits, is there the capacity there to cope with the billion and really give quality delivery of tutoring and programmes that can actually sort out all these gaps? And certainly it can't be done in a year. So I think we should recommend, I think there ought to be a recommendation personally that we call on the government to look at how they're going to address this after this particular school year, and that we see it as a long-term issue which will need funding over a considerable period of time. I think that's the least we can do as a recommendation. And also, I think, having said that, particularly I think the early years stuff and what's happening and what's really good practice, well, if we can find out how people have tapped into that and got some really good stuff to help those kids who missed out on their phonics at a crucial period, because that is a gap that's going to take a long time. Because as the brain gets older, it gets less plastic and less receptive to some things. You know, it's just a fact you've got to know, the old Piaget stuff of education. I don't know if Piaget is ever mentioned these days. Good, I'm glad to hear he is. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I totally agree. To solve this many children have missed out of a huge amount of school time, and to try and to tell them they can catch up in a year with a small amount of funding. Like you said, the least what we can do is to have a recommendation on to call the government. So I've added that in if everyone's agreed to that. Yep.
Thank you, Chair. I think absolutely it's something that we need to look at, but I think putting the onus on the national government at this level, it's got to be a combination of our partners, our schools, our parents, our children all working together. You can throw it, as you've pointed out, you can throw as much money or as little money or whatever. It's not always the answer if we haven't got the tutors available, if we've got to look at outside the box thinking of how we can get this information into these children and the skills that they need to develop in a different way, using technologies and making sure, and I know that there's funding around laptops and equipments that are available for children to bring on those skills as well as part of this. So I think it's important. It's not just we recommend that government do this. We need to be recommending that our schools, our partners, look at a way of working together over the next several years to fill those gaps, and looking at sort of innovative ways to do that as an authority rather than, because we could get all the money in the world and it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to have the tutors available and the time. It's a never-ending cycle here, because we've got, even now as I speak, I know that some schools are having to send years home because they're not being able to function because of the number of teachers off with COVID at the moment. So they're forever on, let alone catch up from the prior. They've also got to maintain their current learning levels and everything else. So we need to be thinking, as a city, what can we do that's different, outside the box, and challenging ourselves to work with our partners and our schools and as an authority to see what we can do to progress that going forward, because it really isn't just about the money.
Thank you. When schools have been given 1/15 of what is required, I think the least we can do is ask the government for a bit more support. And when you said about thinking outside the box, that's when the feedback, I believe, with the returns in the next report, we can use that information and share that knowledge to help us progress. But I think we still need to ask the government in this stage for a bit more.
Absolutely, Chair. I think you, Councillor Hesselgrave, picked up on the fact that some of the best teaching happens in classes, but there are a number of pupils who've really benefited and have worked really well with the Teams type supports that's been available throughout the pandemic. I know that that doesn't work for every child, even those that are neurotypical and as well. So it's not always one thing fits for every pupil. We have to make it a bespoke thing that works for a variety of learners and the way that they learn.
Okay. Any more questions? Going on to the recommendations then. So we've got the first two, which is to consider the presentation, to make any further comments or recommendations following discussion of the presentation received, to bring back the report post-January when we got the full returns and feedback from schools, and then to call on the government for more action. Are we in agreement with that?
I think it's and funding over a longer period of time to address this issue. Substantial funding over a period of time.
Sorry. I've got the board call on government to look at how they'll address this after the current school year. We see this as a long-term issue that will need funding over a period of time.
Can I ask, Chair, if we can put in the recommendation there about working with our partners and you know, looking at the complexities and using the all different areas of ways of tackling this, not just reliant on government funding.
Yeah, I'm happy with that. Is everyone else?
Chair, I don't know how we dispose of this issue of the recommendation of calling on the government. I know the leader of the council has been asked to do that in the motion that was proposed and amended with Lib Dems and support of all parties, I think. But how do we progress that? Are we asking you or Councillor Lynn to write to the Secretary of State and put that case? I mean, it's just technical in terms of what happens after this meeting. You know, it's something for officers to take away and then distill into a letter from someone or other, I would imagine.
Yeah, so it would be the chair of this board. So we'll get that done. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, moving on to item 7, which is community... sorry, wrong way. Send funding capital consultation.
Thank you. So that's me again, and I've been asked to again give an overview of what is currently a live consultation, just to give you a little bit more detail on it and give you the opportunity to ask any questions. And I would actually see this as part of the consultation process as well, but very keen that everybody has the opportunity to understand it and to respond. So there is £8.82 million worth of SEND capital funding for us to invest in developing SEND provision across Derby. This, to be clear, is ring-fenced funding only for SEND capital costs, not for revenue, nor is it for general or mainstream schooling, but to be earmarked for SEND. That question has been asked a couple of times, so I wanted to make that crystal clear. Next slide. So the background is really, you know, this is our SEND vision, living my best life, and we really believe in working very closely together, that consultation has not been a quick fire thing in this case. We have really co-produced the work that we've done on this proposal, and I'll take you through it now. Thank you. Just to remind you as well that we're building on some positivity back from Ofsted. We had the SEND revisit following the initial inspection in 2019. We were revisited in October 21, and we have been successful in making sufficient progress in all 5 areas, which is great. And what is being said in the report is there has been a significant change of culture since the initial area send inspection 2019, and there is now a clear strategy for improving provision and outcomes for children and young people with SEND. And it's really good to have that recognised by Ofsted and the Care Quality Commission. And I think, you know, it gives us a basis for this consultation. That's why I wanted to mention it here, that we actually have a deeper understanding of the SEND landscape, and we also have a deeper understanding about where we want to go for the future. Moving on. So co-production, we've worked with parent representative partners and head teachers to co-produce a series of proposals which we think will help to improve both mainstream and specialist provision for children with young people with SEND. Thank you. We have taken our time to do this because we wanted to ask people their views, and in December 2020 we sent out a call for views across the whole city, and this call for views is the foundation for the consultation that's open now. And those were the outcomes of the call for views, and the requirement to strengthen the support that's provided through the graduated response, which is the whole ladder of support that comes for children and young people with additional needs, to support children with SEND earlier in their lives and reduce the need for specialist support later on, to provide more enhanced resource places in mainstream schools across the city, and to provide more support for children and young people with social, emotional and mental health needs. Also, to quality assure the special schools and settings we have in Derby and those we use outside the city. Some of those recommendations don't fall within the remit of this capital programme, but some of them do. And, you know, we have 8.82 million pounds. We'd need a heck of a lot more to get everything that we wanted. So what we have to do is to act in a very strategic way and to see this as, you know, another step, if you like, in the right direction to help more children live their best lives with SEND in Derby, bearing in mind that we can't do everything within this funding envelope. Moving on. So the key proposals based on co-production with the whole local area are that we would look at a new provision, a primary inclusion hub proposed at Cottons Farm Primary School. The reason why Cottons Farm Primary School has been selected is because they do have surplus space in there, so we're taking some quite pragmatic decisions about space. And also the trust working there, the Harmony Trust, also have a similar inclusion hub in their schools in Oldham, which is working really well, again meeting children and young people's needs sooner. So this is part of the proposal. Secondary specialist provision. It is really important that we improve our secondary specialist provision at St Clair's School, which is currently very, very small in terms of the floor space to deliver a full secondary curriculum. And we'd also like to improve provision in mainstream secondary schools, and subject to available funding, and once the scale of the St Clair's scheme has been agreed, the proposal is to establish an increased offer of enhanced resource bases within schools across the city, and ultimately we want to see enhanced resource bases in all localities across the city. So, you know, this is about the beginning of a new SEND capital programme which will develop over time. Thank you. Next slide. So the consultation is currently open. It's using a new formula called Have Your Say. You can find it on the SEND Local Offer, Derby SEND Local Offer website. And it closes on the 12th of January 2022. We are including equality impact assessments, several. We have worked on languages and accessibility. We've engaged with the school sector, particularly specialist schools. Special school head teachers are very interested in supporting all of this. They're interested they've been submitting ideas, and I'll just give you a taster. One of those is that some of our specialist schools actually run the enhanced resource units in mainstream schools, and that they give more support and continued professional development to teachers in mainstream schools. So we've got a really great group of special school heads who want to really help us across the city. And we are proposing that the feasibility study for the St Clair's programme is to run concurrently with this consultation. So that's taking place now. So I just encourage you all to go on to the consultation and have your say. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much for that detailed report. I think we all agree that it's very pleasing that Ofsted has come back and said there have been significant changes, change of culture since the initial area ascend inspection in 2019, and that there is now a clear strategy for improving provisioning and outcomes for children and young people with SEND. I just have a question, which is, I read that more EHC plans are now completed within 20 weeks timescale, which is great news. However, the rollout of a service-wide digital tool to improve the quality, writing and sharing of plans was delayed by the pandemic. Can I ask when this be introduced, please?
Yeah, so we've looked at the letter that came from Ofsted and the CQC, and clearly there is still work to be done. It just means that we are now at least at an acceptable level in some aspects, and I would agree that not all of the EHCPs are of the standard required. It's a huge job at the same time as we've got huge demand for EHCPs. But what we do now have is a team that puts children first, that the tone and the language and the relationship with parents has changed dramatically. When absolutely not here to say that everything is perfect, but I do want to draw a line and say that Ofsted and the CQC have completely recognise the work that we've done. We recognise that there is further work to be done, and we're putting together a single inclusion plan for special needs, which identifies which areas we need to improve next or over the coming 2 to 3 years, and that's currently in development. Yeah.
Is there a timescale for this development? This tool, which is in development, is there a timescale you got?
Sorry, I can't hear you.
Sorry, is there a timescale for this tool? What's in development?
It's a plan. It's a co-produced single plan. We've been working on it for several months. We are putting it pen to paper, if you like, in January, having had many workshops and co-produced this with a whole range of partners, which is the correct way to do it. But there will be a plan before Easter. I just want to be clear that the co-production element of this is more important than getting a piece of paper in front of everyone.
Thank you. Has anyone got any questions? If we go with Councillor Pandey first.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I just saw about the hubs, the proposal plan for the hubs, one at the cotton farm. Yeah, can you just elaborate? Just can tell us a bit more. What are these hubs?
Yeah,
and how would they work?
If you think about the ladder of support that children have through school, you have the mainstream school, and then if children need more support, they might go to an enhanced resource unit in a mainstream school, and then maybe need to go to a special school. So there are those tiers. What we're aiming to do is to create another layer, which is the inclusion hub within a mainstream school that is lower than an enhanced resource unit, but giving more specialist support within the mainstream school. So we're creating a new tier, and that's because we want more children to stay in mainstream, but we also want them to have the support that they require. So again, we do have a model for that from the teaching school in Oldham, and we're really keen to look at that.
So if this is successful, then you will look to have it in other schools as well. Is that the plan? Yeah.
Yes, potentially. If the funding model works and if parents feel it's successful, very important to us that parents like this provision and that children are thriving there. So then we could come back to you and discuss a potential rollout of inclusion hubs. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's really important to note how challenging this has been from the offset. I think, you know, as I said earlier, I've been a parent of children with SEND for 14 plus years now, and the journey has been very different throughout those timescales from the early years and mainstream schooling to, and I've seen every level, I think, of support that's been available. And I think that we've got to accept that there are challenges that we've had in the past where a number of children have automatically jumped to that specialist provision that with the right support could have managed in a mainstream setting, and therefore it's taken the numbers of available spaces for those more complex needs out, and therefore hence why we've had a lot of external placements as opposed to local authority. I think that's been a massive challenge, and changing that isn't just about changing the support that's available, it's about changing the mindsets of the parents that are accessing that support, and you know, for them to be ensured that they are getting the provision. And that's a really difficult act. You know, I've been that parent that has been very challenging to the team of educational healthcare plans, and you know, you feel you've got to fight for the best, like every parent would. And I think we've got to find that balance now, and I think the only way to do that is to get the schools to embrace supporting our SEND children throughout the whole level, from mainstream early years through to the specialist placements that are available. And I have to say there has been a massive change in a number of schools. I think the officers would support me in saying we're not 100% there with every school in Derby. There are some real positive changes of schools and pupils. I think it's been, the other thing for me is that's been really enlightening as a parent is the benefit that children within a mainstream school have by seeing people with special educational needs, working with them, having the empathy with them, the real life that not everybody is a mainstream person, you know, and I think that really does help to support not only the people with children with SEND, but it helps create rounded individuals within a mainstream setting to support them and give them the understanding of the complexities of other people. And I think that's a real benefit that we don't always tap into, that we don't always focus on, that actually it's not just about the benefit for the children with SEND, it's about widening the experience and the knowledge base of our children within mainstream setting to understand, because you know that we've got so much more of an understanding now of all the complexities and from when I was at school that you know you might have had the odd person with dyslexia or you know or that was just the naughty kid in the corner. Things have moved on an awful long way now, and there are so many different diagnoses and so many different things, and as somebody once said to me, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. You know, it's such a variety of needs, and I think by giving that, I think it creates a much better rounded society and a rounded culture within the city. So I think that is a real focus for us as a city, and I think that's a benefit that we could see by having more hubs within local schools, and then obviously that would help to tackle the issues that we've had as a city around transport and the pressures that we've had from people having to go from one side of the city to the other or to out of areas, and the cost implications on the council for that, because there haven't been that support and that knowledge available within mainstream schools or hubs, etc. So I think this can only be a benefit. I know it's not going to happen overnight, and I think there's some fantastic work that's gone on to get us where we are today. And I think a particular call out to Parent Carers Forum and the fantastic co-production that they've been doing to help us to get to this kind of a place. And I really hope that we can move forward and start to see this supertanker move into a place where not only the children with SEND are supported appropriately in the right settings, but we as a city become a more rounded city and understanding of complex needs as a whole.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's also been noted by Ofsted, who's recognised the changes, and it seems like we are moving in the right direction. Councillor Hazelgrave?
I think I'm coming from a very similar position to Councillor Ralston, really. I think there had been at a certain point a kind of gradual breakdown of trust between parents with children with an EHCP and the authority and schools. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the hard work that's been done to turn that round, and it's quite clear that it has been turned round by and validated by outside bodies such as Ofsted and the CRC, is it, or CIC? CQC, yeah. So that change in culture by the authority and the clear way you've gone about that and working with parents is has been really important, and has actually got people to start looking at this, taking their schools and the authority seriously as people who are working in their best interests. So that's great, and I do hope it gives parents more confidence and the wish to approach finding a solution for what they perceive as their children's needs as early as possible, so the early intervention takes place. And it's back from parents, not schools saying your child needs this. It's parents coming to accept and then working and feeling they can talk to school and the authority and any other agencies, doctors, whoever, to get to the right place for an EHCP that can support that child. Now, I used to work in a school, St Benedict, that has, I still believe it has, a visually impaired enhanced resource base. And the model for that was that there was a team, quite a large team of people who prepared resources for children to use in the mainstream classroom, so that the resources were adapted for that child to access the curriculum and go into a mainstream lesson. So just to dispel, that is the model, that's the ideal model. There might have been withdrawn for certain small sections, but no one spent routinely most of the day or most of the week, certainly not, in terms of being withdrawn to the unit and supported. Disabled children were taken if they needed physiotherapy. There was a physiotherapy section as well, so it wasn't just enhanced resource for visually impaired, it was also for any disabled children, because the school was very disabled friendly in its setup. So I think it's really important that, and it's also really important for those children to go into a mainstream secondary school where there's a culture of high expectations for the children. And also for the children who don't have any disabilities or visually impairment, it's really good to see them understanding that, you know, they're people like everybody else. They're not kind of kept away. They're in mainstream. They get on with things. They learn like them. They may need help, but they get on with it and they make progress. And they get GCSEs at the end of it. Yeah? So that, you know, the high expectations pay off in all sorts of ways. So I think it's a really good model. I'm really pleased that this is going to be developed, and that the issue will be attracting high quality staff who really know their stuff to actually provide the kind of support in a mainstream setting. And I know the teachers will really need it, because I certainly couldn't have coped with having to produce resources of all kinds, different size type, some on yellow paper, black writing on yellow paper, some the opposite. You had black paper with white writing, all sorts of things, and that was done in the background. I obviously had to plan in advance and tell them, but that's what teachers do anyway. They plan their lessons to make sure everything's accessible to all the children. So I think this is really good. I think it's good in terms of whole school, if it has an ERB, and I think it's good for those particular children that they go to the best setting for them. And if it's a secondary school, they get the support to thrive.
Yep, I totally agree. Just on the consultation, you said that ends in January, is that right? 12th of January. Is it worth making a recommendation that we have the report come back to us in the new year?
Yes. Thank you, Chair. And I'm sure this has probably come up in throughout this consultation, but I think another side benefit of what we're talking about today is those that can access education close to home also gain that social skills and the social ability, because one of the things I know my boys have struggled with is the fact that they don't have a social circle close to home, so they don't go out like their friends. They don't have that network, and therefore they struggle socially. And again, this is something that having hubs and schools local, closer to home and in a local environment means they build up that. You know, I've seen a very different side, that my daughter has a better social life than I do. You know, she's out every day of the week with various people and various friends in the local area because she's created that network. And you know, and that isn't as easily accessible for a child who's going to a school that's 5 or 6 miles away, and you don't have those relationships with parents to build up those sort of bonds and have that cross-sharing of experiences. So again, just to another added side benefit of this sort of a thing, it's so key to get this right throughout the city.
Okay, if we have no more questions then, and just moving on to the recommendations, to consider the presentation, to make any further comments on or recommendations following discussion on the presentation received. So I'd like to add to update the board on the capital programme consultation. Are we all in agreement? Okay, moving on to item 8, strategy, schools, place, planning and school admissions.
Thank you, Chair. I'll take you through the presentation. There's a full report on the agenda as well. Thank you, Dom. Yeah, great, thank you. So in terms of background, Chair, as you know, councils, local authority have a legal duty to ensure there are sufficient school places within the children residing within the local boundary. As a council local authority, we carefully monitor all people numbers and trends, and then forward plan the commissioning of school places in response to both population growth, population changes, sorry, should I say, and housing growth linked to core housing strategies. Thank you, Dom. In terms of citywide people numbers, they increased significantly over previous years. The current position, as outlined in the briefing note bulletin attached to the papers, people numbers moving into reception are now beginning to gradually decline, and high numbers are now moving from primary education to secondary. So therefore the focus for us is around secondary numbers at this stage. As a result of increasing secondary pupil numbers, a number of secondary school expansions were implemented in 2018, 2019 to meet that growth. Thank you, Dom. So in terms of next steps in relation to secondary numbers, Year 7 pupil numbers will peak around 2023-24. A major school expansion project, the most recent one, Chair, I should say, was the Lando Forte one just agreed a month or so ago in relation to a £12 million capital expansion approved by Cabinet on 10th of November, which will add an additional 520 school places across 7 to 11 year groups. Other secondary expansions have previously been done as well in order to ensure sufficient places. And numbers will continue to be carefully monitored going forward. Thank you, Dom. Moving on to housing. Derby City Council has been working closely with partners in Amber Valley Borough Council and South Derbyshire District Councils to look at separate but aligned local plans for new housing. There are proposals for around 18,000 properties within Derby or on the edge of the city, often known as the Derby urban area. Generally speaking, sites of over 750 new homes usually require a new primary school on site. Thank you. And sharing this slide is summarising the larger developments where primary schools either have been built or are proposed. So the one in Castle Ward in the city centre, former DRI, near the DRI site, is now open. That big housing development around Ricknell Road for 900 dwellings is still kind of progressing with developers, so no timescale of a new school, but a development of that size will have a new primary school. Hackwood Primary School in Mickleover, that's been built and open. And then the only other school that's proposed at this stage is at Baltimore, Snellsmore Grange, where there's a big housing development, the city element at least of Baltimore, of 800 dwellings. Thank you. Moving on to school admissions information, number of applications for reception intake and secondary transfer reflect the increasing number of pupil numbers and projections. Derby has positively continued to sustain a high percentage of first preference and top three preferences. And on appeals, due to the COVID pandemic, school admissions appeals have been adapted in accordance with the DfE temporary guidance, and appeals were heard virtually, or have been heard virtually, since April 2020, and returning to face-to-face hearings in October 2021, although of course we're closely monitoring the current impact of COVID. So Chair, in summary, that's a summary snapshot of housing developments, school place planning, focus on secondary, and the fact that Derby is in a good position in relation to admissions offers, both first, second and third preferences. Chair, happy to take any questions.
Thank you for bringing this report to the board. I just have one quick question. I see the primary school placements, the children is on a decrease now after peak in 2019. Is that a similar trend nationally? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just to confirm, so when you look at ONS data, certainly over a longer period, so we are mirroring the trends nationally, because birth data, GP data, health data is used, and it has that longitudinal impact. And yes, we're mirroring the ONS position.
Has anyone else got any questions?
Thank you, Chair. I think it is interesting this dip that we're seeing in the primary age levels and the impact that that's going to have on the city as a whole. And I think it's one we've had a conversation about in the past, Gamal, around Spondon and Oakwood, and the fact that we've got within West Park, within this report, an increase in numbers into West Park, but also the specialist provision at Springfield having a direct impact on one road, so one set of residents, and the impact that that's had. I suppose just to highlight the concerns that I have around Landau 40 and the city centre element around that, and again the impact on access to the schools. I think it's picking up on what we've said earlier about trying to get people to be local where possible, and I think that's a challenge in itself, and I think that's a challenge being put on us by the current government and the stance around how parent preference is in comparison to school placement planning, if you like, and I think we see that particularly in certain areas, and as I say, Spondon around the fact that Oakwood hasn't had that increased number of primary settings there, and that does impact directly on Spondon that has 4 primary settings, and a lot of those children therefore travel to school rather than walk to school, and I think that's something that we should be taking into consideration going forward, and the impact on not only making sure we've got the right numbers, but we've got them in the right places, and the accessibility, and trying to reduce the impact not only for the people living in the areas, but obviously for the climate and the fact that the implications of people driving miles to school as opposed to walking down the road is something that we need to, as an authority, be trying to look at how we can mitigate and push and support parents to make the right choices, and make sure that those schools are the right places for those individuals.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. That I totally agree with what Councillor Rolster's been saying. It's sometimes around hearts and minds, schools, trusts and the council working with families and schools to encourage good travel plans in relation to buses, and particularly when you're talking about city centre location. And equally, Chair, in terms of that's why most councils similar to ourselves have a policy around dwellings, housing estates, around 700, 800 dwellings, creating a community, providing a primary school on site, which then avoids all the traffic movement as well. But absolutely, in view of the climate change agenda, the whole system, including the council and families and schools, encouraging sensible travel arrangements when it's depending on age group of children. But totally agree, Chair, in terms of observations and comments.
Thank you, Gamal. Just to clarify, we know that there are a number of children from Oakwood, and then just to clarify the numbers of primary available in Oakwood, because a lot of the housing that's there does tend to be starter families, or you get the bigger housing, but you've got a large lettings sort of starting families there, so you get a lot of younger people as well. And we know that the developments that are happening on the edge of our city, is there any plans for an increase or any funding available from within Oakwood to support making sure that there's enough places within Oakwood itself?
Thank you, Chair. Just to clarify, in terms of Oakwood, there are no major housing developments. They're much smaller than the large scale, and when you look at smaller housing developments, and including the larger ones as well, actually, to be honest, you then get into technical points with developers. In reality, is a developer is only required to provide additional capital funding if, as a result of their development, there are insufficient places. And that's where places like Oakwood tend to come in, where you're looking at smaller ones. The first kind of examination really is a new school needed, or actually are there places available within the local area. So that's why, generally speaking, it's the big developments that tend to attract some of the big capital funding than the smaller ones, because there might be surplus places. And if there wasn't surplus places, then of course there is an opportunity.
So as we're looking at this then, Gamal, for example, is the pinch points, I mean, I presume just from my own experience that Oakwood may be one of those areas that there's pinch points where there's particular, because we're looking at it as a city-wide numbers as opposed to individual areas across the city. And I think it's important that we perhaps consider if there's areas like Oakwood, but we know, for example, the Mickleover development have seen Hackwood Farm be built, and therefore, but as we've stated with Oakwood, it's tended to be smaller numbers, but over 10 years, those numbers have massively actually increased the number of properties and therefore the number of requirements. So I think from a perspective from us as a scrutiny, it's not just about looking at the whole picture in the city, but also the pinch points across the city and the pressure points that we may have in particular wards.
Yeah, thank you, Jez. Just to confirm, absolutely right, spot on with that. So when you look at the methodology that authorities use, we use a similar one, which is the same as the model that the DFE use. So whilst you'll look at a helicopter view, but then it's broken down into clusters and wards. So we do tend to look at that ward stroke cluster level. And if you take Oakwood as an example, looking at sort of the number of schools out there, the number of pockets of new developments that warrant additional places, or whether there are sufficient places, looking at that cluster level. So, for example, from memory, I'm trying to think back now when Parkview Primary was built. Parkview Primary was probably built from memory to do with growth in numbers and the growth of the Oakwood estate. So you're probably talking about when would a new school be needed. It'll be in that balance between how many schools are there in that particular area, looking at forecast numbers within that cluster level, not just a helicopter view, and then to make sure there's a good match and forward planning to ensure some tolerant surplus of around sort of 5 to 10% within a cluster. Because as we know, Chair, when you're looking at fulfilling your legal duty, school place planning isn't a tap we can turn on or off. So you're trying to have a flexibility to be able to flex, not to have over provision or under provision within that. But just as reassurance, we do tend to look at cluster level, which is the next level down from the overarching forecasting techniques.
Thanks for this report, Gamal, and thanks to the team for all the work you do over the time, you know, all that number crunching that needs to go on and looking what's in the offing and where, you know, we will need down the line more primaries and then particularly more new build on secondary schools. My question's really about the issue of school admissions and appeals, the whole thing of, I think they're called normal areas. And how long is it since normal areas have been reviewed in the city? The whole picture, because the demographics have changed. We've had lots of new build. We've got new schools all over the place on the way or actually established. How long is it since we had a review? And do you think it may be time for us to have a look at that at some point?
Thank you, Chair. In terms of overall review of areas, it's probably been an awful long time. But the reality of it is that each time a new school is created, a new normal area is also established, certainly at primary, within the curtilage of the new housing development. And secondary is more complicated, but that is also considered to sort of say, actually, is the housing development within an existing secondary school normal area? So they are looked at with that lens. In terms of, I mean, academies, maintained schools and governing bodies are responsible for their admissions as well as we are. But, you know, in the current landscape, there are fewer schools that are maintained, but there are multi-academy trusts, which is absolutely fine. So at this stage, that system works effectively because you have an existing normal area where you have a new housing development. So in terms of whole-scale review, you know, on the face of it, I'll probably say there isn't an immediate need to do that for the factors that I've outlined, because once you start moving the lines for whatever, the rationale needs to be secure, because it can have some serious unintended consequences, but equally importantly is fundamentally to ensure that the normal area for a secondary or primary is working effectively, and any young families, children and parents know that if I live in this particular area, this is my local community type of school, both at primary and secondary, but I do have an opportunity to express preference in other schools as well. So in summary, I would say there probably isn't a need on balance to review, but we continue to monitor very closely.
Could I just, I mean, I think I'm more concerned about secondary normal areas, partly because, you know, there are only so many places in the really good schools in the city, and getting into a really good school, it changes the life chances of pupils to get there. I think there probably would be more demand for that than you think, and you know, people have choices, but I think when it comes to secondary pupils, they're more prepared for their children to travel further from home to get to a school that will, you know, really bring them on and get, you know, give them a good education. And I do think that I think it might be worth looking at secondary level whether the normal areas now are appropriate. Personally, but I'm just asking for, I mean, I'd like to make a recommendation that some work be done on looking at whether for secondary schools, normal areas, there ought to be some kind of review. Yeah, I know that parents can choose 1, 2, 3, etc., and you try your best to make sure they get the first, second or third, and the higher the better. It can't possibly work for everyone. If everybody plumps for one school, there's an issue there, yeah?
Thank you, Chair. Again, briefly, yeah, I think you're right. The complicating factors tend to be kind of, we'd all agree that every school in the local area should be a good school, and therefore that's kind of what all councils and trusts and academies and ourselves would want. Therefore, we don't have this push-pull going on. And also, Chair, there is always a tipping point. When you look at the schools within the city, generally you want to be at around, 1,500 plus sixth form, which is about 10 forms of entry. And therefore, if you look at all the schools within the city following these expansions, they're all around that size. So there is a danger just because School A is doing particularly well, and therefore, by implication, let's double its size from 1,500 to 3,000. It can actually have the opposite effect, and therefore there's always that. I know how this scrutiny will understand that balance between ensuring every school is a good school and a good cohort of young people attending, and therefore sometimes the lens has to focus on how do we make this particular school and the local area wish to send their children, or families send their children to the local school, then say travel 5 miles because of all the issues we've talked about. So Chair, there would be the general kind of observations and comments, but the recommendation of course is for you to consider. I'm just kind of outlining some of the pros and cons of that sort of debate around expansion of a popular school doesn't equal huge success, because you can have multiple schools within a school. If you look at John Port, which is probably very big now, it's probably got 2 secondaries within one and multiple other schools. So not saying it's not a good school, but they're the issues that tend to play out or come to the forefront with those matters. Thank you.
I think I was just going to kind of agree with you and say that I'd like to think that all the schools were good schools, and that the difference that parents perceive between their choices are purely cosmetic. And, I'd like to think that some of the ones that were less popular, that perhaps, something was done to make them so that they were more of a mainstream choice. I'd hate to think that any children in the city were just, given whatever was left over, everybody should get the best choice, and I would just like to sort of raise that point that I'd like to think that the choices are, more perceived than real.
I like to echo them points as well. We want every school in Derby to be a good school, and it will avoid people sending their children to a school which might be 5 miles away, which will have a impact on the environment, and then you get problems with cars parking outside the schools, which, as us councillors, will probably get many emails and phone calls about that. So if we can try and send our children to a local school, which is a good school, and get them to walk, to cycle to school, it would be better for them, their health, their mental health. Councillor Boston.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more. I think the focus on the review, if you like, of what a local area is should be more around the focus around supporting people to walk to school or to bike to school, and perhaps that should be the focus as opposed to individualised preferences or priorities of schools, because absolutely, if every school in this city should be good or above, we know that that isn't always going to be the case, as Gamel's pointed out, as things change, whether that's increase in numbers or changes in heads, or there's always going to be blips in every system that we have, but we should be looking at whether the review is in line more with accessibility and on our focus as a council to improve the environmental impact, perhaps, as opposed to preference of schools based on the current status of a school, because with any school they can change with whatever occurs. And I think I would agree, it would be nice to look at this as a scrutiny board, to look at what is the local schooling, but more on the basis of how can we encourage people to be in a local school, from a, looking at the bus routes that are accessible to it, looking at the cycle routes that are accessible to it, and because I know that some of the areas are quite elongated and not necessarily a rounded of the school, and that's perhaps something that we need to review. It may be a very complex one to look at, Gamel, and I'm not suggesting that we do it overnight, but I do think as part of the authorities' push towards the environmental impacts that we're having as a city, then I think we should focus it on that as opposed to anything else.
Any more questions? Okay, just moving on to the recommendation. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay, yeah. Recommendation 2.1 to note the strategy schools place planning update relating to a population change and the proposed long-term housing growth arising with core strategies. To note the Derby City Council achievements against national results for primary and secondary schools, admissions offered and appeals. And also to have a look at local schools and to try and get children, you might have to reword this, but to get children into their local schools where possible and have a look at accessibility in terms of if people can get the right buses to school and cycle routes and stuff like that.
Sorry, is that part of Councillor Hazelgrave's recommendation or is that separate?
If you could put them both together, if
Yeah.
you don't make it too wordy and complex.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's fine.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you, Chair. I was just going to add to that. That makes perfect sense, and agree with what Cultural Ralston is suggesting around that whole climate change, environmental agenda as a city-wide view around how could we mitigate all forms of travel, including schools. And I think that's that wider environmental and climate change type of travel sustainability around as a council, as all kind of councils and cities are looking at how can we minimise travel and sustainability. Whilst it's a complex work, I think coming from that perspective as a sustainability item almost runs into the other aspects as well. Thank you, Chair.
I think, Mel, then, would that allow that, as a council, perhaps, whether we can add a weighted percentage or whatever in terms of priorities placements going forward? And I think if we do that review, it might help towards that placement planning going forward if this is part of the weighting of those decision making.
Chair, unfortunately, the legislation in terms of school admissions determines the criteria that legally needs to be used. What I think we've discussed this evening is really around the hearts and minds around travel and sustainability, and the general debate around every school in a local community should be a good school. And those are easy words but hard to achieve, but I think certainly around hearts and minds around travel sustainability is certainly a key agenda at the moment. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Moving on to item 9, work programmes and topic review. Are we all happy with the current work topics? I think that is a yes.
Sorry.
Stop.
Oh.
Sorry, Dom.
Oh, sorry, Chair. Just before we get into the work programme, we have the appointment of co-opted members.
Okay.
Sorry. So there's provision for up to 8 co-opted members to be appointed to the Children, Young People Overview and Scrutiny Board to take part in discussion on education matters. 3 are directly nominated faith representatives as categorised as Church of England, Catholic and other faiths, while between 2 and 5 parent governors can also be appointed. So the 2 recommendations are to note that the process for nomination/renomination of 3 co-opted faith representatives and the election process for 2 to 5 co-opted parent governors has been started, and to note that once the process has been completed, the board and council will be asked to approve the nominations for 3 co-opted faith representatives and note the election of between 2 to 5 co-opted parent governors. Thank you.
Are we all in favour of the recommendations? Thank you. Moving on to, well, I have on my sheet item 9. I'm not sure if it's item 10 now. Work programmes and topic review. Councillor Hazelgrave, will you going to say something on that matter?
I'd support that, Chair. I think there's the underlying issue of COVID again here and not being able to access dental as a major, but also those children that have been at home perhaps not having the diet that they may have at school and the impact that they might have on their teeth, etc. I'd support that. That's something that we bring forward as soon as possible.
Yep, I also agree. Okay. Okay, thank you for attending tonight's meeting. That's everything on the agenda. It's the last meeting before Christmas and New Year, so I'd like to wish you all a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Thank you.